Okay, so something genuinely historic is unfolding in Crimea right now, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on just how significant this moment actually is. About a year ago, I put out a series of videos arguing that Ukraine was quietly laying the groundwork for something most analysts thought was flat out impossible, a strategic siege of Crimea, not a frontal assault, not a dramatic amphibious landing, something far more patient, far more calculated, and honestly, far more effective. The Russian military blogger community went absolutely feral over those videos. They made response content. They called the whole premise delusional. They said Ukraine didn't have the tools, the range, or the strategy to ever pull this off. So you'll understand why I'm in a pretty good mood right now, because what we've watched unfold over the last few months isn't just progress toward the scenario I described, it's the scenario playing out almost beat for beat. And just recently, we crossed what I'd consider a genuine strategic inflection point. Crimea, for the first time in this entire war, is simultaneously cut off from virtually every major supply route it has ever relied on. But here's the thing, this didn't happen overnight. What we're witnessing today is the payoff of a methodical, multi-layered Ukrainian campaign that's been building for months. And to really understand why this matters, you need to follow three separate threads: what's happening with Crimea's air defenses, what's happening with its supply corridors, and what's happened to the storage infrastructure that used to make it resilient against disruption. When all three of those things collapse at the same time, which is essentially where we are now, the strategic picture changes entirely. Let's quickly reset the geography, because it's everything here. Crimea looks like a peninsula on a map, but functionally, strategically, it behaves almost exactly like an island. Its land connections to the outside world are remarkably few. In the north, you've got a narrow isthmus with a limited road and rail corridor. In the east, you've got the Kerch Strait Bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Russia. That's basically it. For years, analysts used this geography as an argument against Ukraine ever reclaiming the peninsula. The logic was, any Ukrainian ground advance would be funneled through a choke point that Russian defenders could hold indefinitely, and an amphibious assault would be catastrophically costly. And they were right about those specific approaches. What they consistently failed to account for was the flip side. Those same choke points that would shred a Ukrainian advance also make it extremely difficult for Russia to move supplies in. The narrow corridors that protect Crimea from invasion are the exact same corridors that make it vulnerable to blockade, and that's precisely the vulnerability Ukraine has been exploiting. Now, the key change that's made all of this newly actionable is Ukraine's expanded drone capability. For a while, the electronic warfare envelope around the front lines effectively limited how far Ukrainian drones could operate with precision. Ukraine has largely solved that problem by equipping relatively low-cost drones with Starlink terminals, giving them reliable communication at ranges of 100 to 300 kilometers from the front. That might sound like a technical footnote, but the operational implications are enormous. It means Ukraine can now strike trucks, trains, fuel depots, and logistics hubs deep inside Russian-controlled territory, not occasionally with expensive missiles, but consistently and at scale with cheap drones. For Crimea specifically, this means Ukraine now has the reach to threaten every single vehicle moving along those northern access corridors. Every truck, every supply convoy, every fuel shipment. They can be targeted from standoff range economically on a daily basis if Ukraine chooses to apply that pressure. The bottleneck that used to protect Russia's logistics in Crimea has become the bottleneck that traps them. And here's where it gets really interesting, because this new capability didn't emerge in isolation. It arrived at exactly the moment Ukraine had already been systematically dismantling Crimea's ability to weather a siege. The first domino fell at the beginning of April, when Ukraine struck Crimea's largest fuel terminal. They didn't just damage it, they destroyed roughly 23 of the 29 storage tanks at the facility. That facility was Russia's buffer. It was what allowed Crimea to keep functioning for weeks or even months if supply lines came under serious pressure. With most of that storage capacity gone, Russia's ability to absorb a sustained disruption has essentially evaporated. If the supply routes go down now, they feel it almost immediately. The second domino was the ferry situation. A little context here, Ukraine struck the Kerch Bridge early in the war, badly enough that Russia didn't feel comfortable running heavy military equipment across it. Tanks, air defense systems, the hardware that actually keeps Crimea defended. So Russia shifted to ferries. They built up a small fleet and used it as a workaround. Ukraine destroyed that fleet in 2024. Then Russia spent roughly 2 years and enormous resources repairing those ferries. They came back online in early 2026. Ukraine waited until they were operational and then struck them again, one in March, one in early April, taking the entire ferry fleet back offline almost immediately after Russia got it running. That's going to take years to repair again, assuming Russia can even find the skilled labor and materials to do it. So now Russia is being pushed back toward the Kerch Bridge as its primary supply artery, the very bridge Russia already concluded wasn't safe for moving military hardware. And on cue, Ukraine has also been targeting the naval vessels responsible for protecting that bridge from underwater drone attacks. The pattern isn't subtle. Ukraine is methodically closing every door. Now zoom out and look at what all of this means together. For the first time in this war, Crimea is simultaneously facing degraded air defenses. Ukraine has destroyed over 100 air defense systems on the peninsula just since early 2026. A compromised fuel storage infrastructure, a destroyed ferry fleet, pressure on the northern road and rail corridors, and a threatened bridge. Every component of the system that has kept Crimea supplied and defended is under stress at the same time. That's not coincidence. That's a campaign. And what makes this particularly significant is what it implies about the path to actually retaking Crimea, because it doesn't require the catastrophic frontal assault everyone used to assume. A siege doesn't need to happen overnight. It's a process. You degrade the defenses, constrain the resupply, reduce the garrison's capacity to replace losses, and over time, the military presence on the peninsula weakens. Once it weakens enough, you don't need to send waves of infantry through a choke point. Ukraine has already shown it can use ground robots to clear infantry positions without human casualties. Put enough drone pressure, enough robotic ground operations, and enough attrition on a sufficiently degraded force, and suddenly the calculus on Crimea changes entirely. The reason Ukraine didn't do this years ago isn't that they couldn't see this possibility, it's that keeping Crimea as an active target zone was genuinely useful. Every air defense battery Russia rushed to Crimea to replace a destroyed one was a battery that didn't go to Moscow or a Siberian factory. Crimea was functioning as a massive attrition engine, drawing in Russian high-value assets and destroying them. That was the first phase. It looks like we may now be entering the second phase.